Good evening. Thank you for joining us for Woke Place Policy, a discussion about Florida's censorship of Black history. My name is Genesis Robinson. I am the political director for Equal Ground, a Black-led voting rights organization working to increase political power for Black folks throughout the state of Florida. We do this through strategic planning, voter registration, and voter education. Tonight, I am joined by a stellar panel of leaders who will help us explore how this nationwide movement to censor conversations about race, privilege, and oppression have somehow made their way to Florida and has taken its form in legislation working its way through our legislature. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our panelists. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Mr. Dick Batchelor, was unable to be with us tonight. However, we were able to identify someone to step in his place. Tonight, we have with us Ms. Ida Wright, Mr. Attorney Kamara Williams, and Mr. Chadwick Leonard. At this time, I will ask each of them to introduce themselves. We will begin with Mrs. Wright, followed by Attorney Williams and Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ida Wright. I live in Daytona Beach, Florida. My background, I served on Volusia County School Board for 8 years, and my last year I served as the chair. I am also the former dean of the College of Business and Entrepreneurship at Bethune-Cookman University. Currently, I have retired. I am working for myself and working with my husband. Good evening.
Hello, good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you, Equal Ground, for allowing me to be a part of this incredible panel. My name is Attorney Kamara Williams. I am a practicing attorney in Orlando, Florida, with the Smith & Williams Trial Group, located 1820 West Colonial Drive. You can actually see us at swtglaw.com. I practice in the areas of employment and probate and estate planning. And also in business and real estate. So I've been in practice for now. I go on practice of 13 years, and I'm just happy to be a part of this panel.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chadwick Leonard. I currently work with the Florida Education Association as a lobbyist and political organizer. My background is in organizing as well as just political work in Central Florida as a whole. I'm also a graduate of the Great Bethune-Cookman University.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your participation in tonight's panel. I want to encourage those of you who are watching online to feel free to ask questions. We want tonight to be an informative discussion, and we welcome the opportunity to interact with you and hear your thoughts. So if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and we will incorporate them in our conversation tonight. Additionally, we invite you to connect with us as we endeavor to defeat legislation such as House Bill 7 and Senate Bill 148. And so tonight, if you text censorship to 52886, again, text the word censorship to 52886, you will get a link to a campaign that we are leading where we are sending emails and contacting our legislators and telling them that we don't want them to support this legislation and the dangerous impact that it has not only on our state, but as a Black community as a whole. So we know the idea of critical race theory is a phenomenon that has gained steam over the last few years, albeit the concept not new. When Donald Trump was president, he took great issue with the publication of the 1619 Project. This publication was written by Nicole Hannah-Jones, published in the New York Times. Her literary analysis explored the origins of America, rife with racism and built on the inhumane institution of slavery. Yet reckoning with this reality has caused some, like Florida governor and the Republican leadership of our state, to join the Trump bandwagon and cry foul when faced with the truth of history. Instead of acknowledging the impact of slavery and racism in this country and committing to atone for those wrongs, the Republican base has conspired to censor truth and limit conversations of race, privilege, and oppression. Presently, in the state of Florida, we have legislation working its way through the legislative process that, if passed, would prohibit businesses and schools and governmental agencies from mandating that people attend mandatory trainings that would make them feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress. These bills create a pathway, in addition, for individuals to sue their employers or their schools. And ultimately, it would amount to the elimination of diversity and inclusion training, cultural competency training, gender and sexual orientation training, as well as conversations about racism and privilege. House Bill 7, introduced by Republican Representative Oliva, and Senate Bill 148, introduced by State Senator Diaz, is set to be voted on by the entire legislature in the coming weeks. So it is of paramount importance that our community, first and foremost, be educated about these bills, but then lean in collectively as we work to defeat them. So we're going to hop right into it. My first question is to the panel as a whole. When you first became aware of this legislation, what did you think about? Like, what were your thoughts when you first heard about this legislation?
If I may, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to give a point of clarification. The 1619 project is actually not critical race theory, and sometimes that is it's a concept that is often intermingled, but it couldn't be farther from the truth. And so a lot of times people have poured that stuff into one another as it's like the same educational concept. Of course, the 1619 project just discussed the history of the United States and its beginnings of slavery all the way until 2019. That was started by a professor at it's at Howard now, I believe. She got a tenure at Howard now. So that's number one. As far as what are my thoughts about this legislation, I thought it was a part of a large insidious plan by the Heritage Foundation. If anybody's familiar with who the Heritage Foundation is, they are a Republican, or I don't even say, they're a conservative think tank that started in early 80s and has now started to institute policies throughout the United States, just not in Florida, of infecting the school systems. And their primary objective is the erasure of any race talk within any school system. And so that's why when you see these bills that have populated all throughout the country, including in our own home state, they all have this similar language, and because they're all byproducts of a plan by the Heritage Foundation to infect the general public's education regarding slavery, discrimination, and of course, oppression.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Mr. Leonard, what are your thoughts? What did you first hear when you heard this legislation or found out about this legislation?
Yeah, when I first viewed this legislation, I would love to say I was surprised, but I wasn't. We knew that the governor of the state is mounting his charge to the White House, and this was one of the main things that he wanted to do here. It just follows the same pattern that we've seen with bringing large national talking points into the state for no reason and with no real design to help the constituency other than to appeal to a certain base and to get them riled up. And so I was not surprised. I was still a bit dismayed, even going through it, all of the things that it has in it and all of the small things that may not be top of mind when looking at this bill, but will still have a very, very detrimental effect to the school system, to private businesses and small businesses as well. So I think that, it's just more of the same, but it's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to this conversation for us to talk about what it looks like in these different spaces.
Okay, great. Ms. Wright?
And I agree with my colleagues. When I first read and heard about the bill, quite naturally, I'm going to reach out to my colleagues that are in the profession, knowing a little bit about the critical race theory, how it began and why it began. I was a little disheartened that so many of our legislators that are attorneys knew from their own professional studies that this was something that they were introduced in law school. It was not something that was in K-12. It was not even something that was on the undergraduate level. It was something on a graduate level. So that was disheartening. I do believe many of them are playing politics. Again, it's one thing to play with your life. It's a different thing to play with children. And so when we talk about critical race theory and we talking about the Heritage Foundation, I'm very familiar with them. It's important to find out who is your audience and what is your purpose and why. So if people leave from this meeting today, I would say we got to stop playing politics. We've got to be honest and open and have some really tough discussions. Normally that can leave you uncomfortable, but I will say this: they should be careful of how they craft this, because it could come back and still haunt them more so than us. And I'll explain that a little later.
Yes, and thank you for that. And I appreciate all of you for providing, really good answer, really detailed answer. Attorney Williams said something that I thought was incredibly important to make that distinction, right? Is although we saw this wave of this conversation begin with the criticism around the 1619 Project, it's very important to acknowledge that project is not critical race theory. It's literally an examination of real, actual facts that have taken place in this country. And so my next question to all of you is, given the fact that there's this insistence on confusing African-American history with critical race theory, what impact do you think that will ultimately have on our country when we continue to confuse those two issues?
Well, I'll start because I'll take my last comment. It's our intent to bring about confusion and discord, you could lead to the very people that you're trying to marginalize to stand up and say, okay, if you don't want to hear about our struggles and the true history, then we're going to remove history from our system altogether. Mm-hmm. And that is far more detrimental to our country as a whole, because now children, be it at any level, will not know about any of their history. White, Black, Hispanic, Asian Americans. So we have to be very, very careful when we're going down this slippery slope, because if your intent, and I don't want to ever say what someone's intent is, but if your intent is to bring harm to a group of people or a segment of people, that can in turn end up being very detrimental into everybody at every level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Mrs. Wright, because I think one thing that it does in the grand scheme of things is the bill itself and this concept of getting rid of certain histories. It allows the plans for future generations to not be as forthcoming in their discontent with it, because it would be all that they knew. They would think that this is all that is, and it's all that has ever been. If they don't have support at home for students, or their parents aren't teaching them stuff, there aren't community outlets to learn these things. You get a generation of people who don't know their own history and don't know that what is not supposed to be. And then you put us in a whirlwind and in a cycle of just repeating these things and getting further and further back, much like what happened after Reconstruction. And so, it's not a very bright. It's not a very bright look into the future with what's going on. But I think, if we prepare ourselves adequately, we can mount a worthy and formidable fight against it. when working together and we're working from all the different places we can work with.
Thank you. Attorney Williams?
Yeah. Well, the impact I see on my industry is that it increased legislation. So listen, like when you have, litigation, when you have a law that is so ambiguous in nature, it's going to be ripe with challenges, and people are now going to have this really unclear, idea of what is and what isn't a violation of that particular law. And so, bills that are so vaguely written, when it's unclear and they're not clear what they affirmatively cover, like say, could a teacher talk about a factual instance that really happened and not be charged with, violating this particular law? Of course, right? Because it's this idea, this Morpheus viewpoint of what history is, and it really depends on one of the counties, the 67 counties. So that's 67 different opinions, and whomever's leading that opinion regarding that particular ideology of what history should or shouldn't be taught, could say, listen, that qualifies as a violation of this law. I'm going to give an example. Like in Alabama, it just came out last week, where there is a state legislature who's proposing a bill to get rid of Black History Month because he feels like that bill, he feels like the teaching of Black History Month encourages racist ideology by, focusing on a particular race and then teaching about the history of this country. I want people to really pay attention here, because most legislators do not just come up with bills out of the thin air. They're actually, it's usually created because there is a sponsorship by an organization has created a 1-sheet, 2-sheet packet to say, okay, now that this has been passed, now let's infiltrate it in this state. And then it becomes a chorus line of, okay, now Alabama, then it becomes Mississippi, then becomes, and then Georgia. And next thing you know, you'll have 12 states that have passed it. And then it becomes a thing, 12 states and then 26 states, and it grows. And that's the same thing that happened with critical race theory. You had one state passing these things, and then next it was just a chorus line of different states. So, what I foresee is that the increase in legislation, but I also foresee that it can actually tire people out from actually having to protect themselves from litigation. And so, they may actually just be like, you know what, I throw my hands up and I'm not going to teach, or I'm just not going to teach history. And that has a dangerous impact. I'm sure we get into that later on in this program, but have a dangerous impact in the overall viewpoint of our country and our country's history.
Absolutely. And yet again, you went to a point where you talked about the long-term impact of that and potentially folks walking away from the profession, right? And so, but another point that I wanted to kind of piggyback on is you mentioned that, these bills and these ideas do not happen in a vacuum, right? And that typically when one state sees success, they typically try to replicate and implement those same type of laws in their state. We saw it with Stand Your Ground. We see it with reproductive justice and the right for women to choose. And so in Virginia, in 2021, we saw the issue of critical race theory become front and center in the gubernatorial campaign for their governor there. And so my question is, why? Why do you believe that this has become such an effective talking point to rile up the Republican base in 2022?
Well,
okay, go ahead.
Right. Oh well, yeah. So I think it's just another tool, right? Mm-hmm. I think this is no different when a few elections ago, immigration and building the wall became a thing. It's no different from terrorism becoming a thing. It's another piece of red meat for people to hop all over, for something to activate debate, something new to activate debate. So they take something that's may have even happened one or two times, and they create this narrative to create paranoia and to create this idea of a crisis. And so I think this time they just chose critical race theory because it was something that was already being talked about during the last administration and carried on over to the last election. And so they're using this for as yet another thing to try to corral their people around and to try to create this division or widen the division that's already there. I think that the sentiments that this bill conveys aren't new. I think that this idea of silencing history is not new, but they are just using this as a time to bring all of this stuff together, leading into this election season to strengthen their base and to keep the base that they already have. So critical race theory, their idea of critical race theory, like Attorney Williams has already said, it's not even real. It's not even factual. But they've created that narrative of what critical race theory is as a catch-all, and now they're going to push it out in as many ways, as many states, and as many places as possible.
So, if I may, also, I want to kind of also peel back the curtain here, because it was in December of 2018 at a conference in Washington, D.C., we're a conservative think tank. I mentioned the Heritage Foundation. It was another group as well that hosted this, and they were thinking of ideas to how can we create a narrative that will allow us to attack the 2022 electoral process. And so this was something that was created 4 years ago, as a structural plan. And they came up with it. And then it was at that point, they honed in on this very, very, very distinct idea of critical race theory, because at the time, it was only taught by, I think, 0.01% of institutions of higher education, right? Because there's not even some professors who even had the educational background to even teach this particular discipline. And so they thought it's perfect because nobody knows what it is. And yet, it sounds like this thing that, a lot of Republicans can actually latch onto. And because not a lot of people know something, that's the best way to weaponize it, right? Because you don't even know what you're talking about. Now, you can't talk about, something that everybody knows, because then there'll be some detractors like, well, this is what it is, because we have a history of hearing about it for the last 20, 30 years. No, they said, let's choose a particular theory that allows us to weaponize it. Now, why has it been so effective? Because what you also have is a large conglomerate of an ignorant populace that are unwilling to look at something with a critical eye. And they allow themselves to be fed information that is not entirely true. I will say this, when you're in trial, it's always an interesting thing. Say people are smart, but humans are stupid. So, right. So when you put them in a grouping, it's like the collective IQ of people drop 10 points, right? Now, extrapolate that over like tens of thousands or millions, tens of millions of people, it automatically drops. That's why people are so dissuaded from slogan campaigns, because once they hear like lemmings, everybody else is repeating the same thing. Then all of a sudden, they're repeating it. Then it must be true. As opposed, and validation of the crowd is what's more important than validation of actually looking into the topic as a whole.
Yes. Ms. Wright, you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think both of my colleagues said it well, because I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. So I will pass on this one. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. So I want to come back to you now on this next question, right? Obviously, we see that there has been a rise of, hateful conversations. We've seen a rise in race relations. We've seen a rise in disinformation. What do you say to those who believe that teaching this type of dark history, the dark side of our history, if you will, leads to more people to be divided and to hate each other. Instead of leaning in and moving forward in terms of how we should be. What do you say to those folks who suggest that?
Well,
I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Wright.
Right.
Professor Wright. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Well, I would just start with first, critical race theory is not in K-12. That's not where that's where it is. Number two, when you talk about history, be it white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever we talk about, there are always dark sides to each of these particular narratives. So as a teacher who's professionally trained should be able to have a conversation about Martin Luther King, should be able to have a conversation about Rosa Parks, should be able to have a conversation about Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And are there some dark parts about their lives? I'm sure it is. But in that, you tell it to the age appropriateness where they would understand. You don't have to talk about the Ku Klux Klan who came to Bethune-Cookman with rifles, and Dr. Bethune and her guard had to stand there, and they refused to flinch. They didn't move. She defended her school. But it's always in a delivery. And if you really are interested in teaching history, you should always teach the facts, but find a way. As professionals, we always find a way to deliver certain conversations based on age appropriateness. And just depending on the age, we should do it. And I'll tell anyone, when we look at our Jewish brothers and sisters, they always make sure their children know their history. When we look at our Asian brothers and sisters, they make sure that their children always know their history. We're no different. We have to make sure people know our history, because if we don't, as the old adage, history will repeat itself.
That's right.
And it's up to us to do that. And so we're not doing it to be spiteful or mean or evil or trying to make you feel bad. We're just stating facts. And we make sure that when we state the facts, we state it where it is age appropriate.
So, I want to piggyback off of Professor Wright here, because one of the things I think it's important to say, though, she made a salient point about how the Jewish community teaches about their history. And I think it's very interesting when we say age appropriate. Now, I agree, critical race theory is not taught in K through 12. But here you have a community that doesn't take off the blinders when it comes to the horrible aspects of the Holocaust. And they teach them at a very young age. So what we're really saying is that, you're saying that children aren't able to handle information, which I actually disagree. Because especially when you see children now, especially on social media, they're able to handle all sorts of information, sometimes negative, right? We see things like on social media, like we don't even want them to understand or get the lyrics of particular songs or particular content is just not appropriate, but yet they still consume it. So when we say that these things that society has almost normalized as far as, content that they can intake, but then we say history is something that it's hard for them to digest. What we're saying is that, the substantive things, the things that are important are not things that, everyday humans in their formative years can even process. So then what happens, and they get to adult age, and then they're like, oh, this is so new to me. This is foreign to me. And at that point, you're fermented in your ideals because you grew up with certain ideals that have lended itself to not now be true. Once you get the truth, once you get the light shown on you about history, you can reject it. And you can say, that's not true because I didn't learn that. And I don't know anything about it. Now, the enlightened people would say, I learned some new information. I'm ready to adjust. But I think we have to be careful. And this is not on anybody, but we have to be careful about, let's say, we don't want these conversations because honestly, I think the earlier we have these conversations, the better. And you have to normalize the harsh conversations about our country. You have to normalize the harsh conversations about our history as a nation. Because if you don't normalize that, then you get adults who are empathized in their understanding of history and culture and people. I'm sorry.
No, but you know what? No, I'm glad you said that because I want to just redirect. His question really was about teachers.
Yes,
and so for teachers, I don't want anyone to be put in a position where they're uncomfortable and they can't explain. Children, I agree with you, but you said something that is so key that if we want to get to the root, it has to start at home. The Jewish community start when their children are 3, 4, 5, every other nationality. We have to start at home at the very same age. So when they do come to school, they have a knowledge of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. They have a knowledge of Madam C.J. Walker.
Yes.
They have the knowledge of the first Black female billionaire. We have to start at home. But his question really dealt with teachers, because if you're non-Black or non-Asian or non-Jewish, you may have a hard time really communicating, not because of the subject area. You don't want to offend the child or children. And you're correct. Children are very resilient. I don't think the things that they listen to, the things, if you give them the computer that they can do on their own, I agree with you. But when you're talking about a teacher, I think that's a conversation we have to have with teachers to find out who's capable, able, and willing. Yes. But I agree with you. We have to start at home, and it started at home at a very young age.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Leonard, you want to hop in there?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I agree with both Professor Wright and Attorney Williams. And what I say, I think that brings up one of the most insidious things about this bill is that it has age-appropriate language in there, right? But because another part of it is based on the feelings of guilt, mental anguish, and those things, I think that even in an age-appropriate setting, even when teachers do what they're supposed to do, right? And a child is unhappy, and it starts a process of investigation, which takes the teacher out of the classroom, which sometimes for months on end during the investigation, it'll take a teacher out of the classroom. And some teachers don't want to come back because of that. And that goes back to the vague nature of the bill, because when you have something so open, it can be implemented in different ways in every district, in every school, in every classroom.
Yes.
And we also have to realize that from the education point of view, we're talking about students, but we're also dealing with the ignorance or the enlightenment of the parent as well. Because if a student goes home and they say, well, I feel uncomfortable, or I feel like I'm being made to feel bad about myself, if they have a parent who understands these concepts already and can explain this out to them, how they shouldn't feel comfortable, well, it is history and this is what happened, and this should lead us to moving forward in our society, that's one thing. But when you have a parent who's already on the certain end of the political and ideological spectrum, that for those type of parents, this is a launching point for them to attack the teacher, attack the school, and attack the district. And so that's one of the worst things about the bill is because even if we do everything that Professor Wright says, even if we do everything that Attorney Williams says, there's always still that possibility of teachers and teachers and business owners and anybody else in these public agencies to be targets. And so I think it's going to be a very tight line to walk, but it's also going to be a very winding line to maneuver at the same time for all industries.
And I'm
sorry, go ahead.
And I agree with you, and that's why I'm going to bring it back to the children. Like you said, children are very resilient. This is normally the conversation. How was school today? It was great. What did you learn? Oh, I learned that Mary McLeod Bethune had a run-in with the Ku Klux Klan. Children are not it's not the child, it's the parent. Let's just be honest. It's always the adult. So the adult is offended by what was taught in school. It is almost 99.9% of the time, children are not our problems. It is the parent.
Absolutely.
And that actually goes into the idea of the idea of how white supremacy is really one of the worst things about the American ideology, right? And it creates this false sense of security in the country and a false sense of self. And so once you pierce the veil of white supremacy, then that's when things start to fall apart. And it's hard for people to really grapple with the idea of like, what exactly is white supremacy? Because they say, oh, well, I don't benefit because I'm white. And in reality, you can make arguments that you actually have received conferred benefits because of the your either your skin color or your gender or even your status in class in society, right? And so that's number one. And so when people are when students come back and they tell their parents that, you know what, this is actually what America did, it challenges the parents' own id about how they see themselves and how they project to see themselves, and how they project to see the country, because a lot of people use the country as a basis of their own self-encouragement. And once that is actually torn down, then you now have a parent, an individual, an adult who now has to challenge themselves and how they see the world. And just, I know I keep going on and on, but one of the things I would say, that history does not divide people, it empowers.
That's right.
You know, and so when we have to always remember that history it never divides. It empowers people, because once you are empowered with knowledge, you have the ability to actually have a critical thinking process in terms of information, of how it's delivered to you and how you see the world. And anybody who feels like it divides people is because what they're saying to themselves is that they don't want their own ideology to be challenged.
Absolutely. And so, Attorney Williams, I wanted to read a portion of text from the bill. Your comments just made me think about something when you said that the issue ultimately is the issue of this false superiority of white privilege, right? And so in the text of the bill, it literally says that it does not want teaching to be defined as racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. That is one of the key elements that they do not want to be taught, that racism is not merely about prejudice, nor is racism embedded in the American society. And so all of us right here on this call, and those who are listening, we know that racism in America is just as American as apple or cherry pie. You can't talk about America without having the conversation of racism and the fact that America was even able to be built on the institution of slavery and what that did for allowing America to be leaps and bounds and ahead of its competition globally.
Well, the thing is, the idea that racism is not embedded in the very fabric of society is obviously an incredible farce, because you had a separatist religious faction come over to this country and declare onto a land that is now their property. And we had then created an entire holiday on the fanciful idea that people can come over and it was all jolly and they shared in the great meal of their being colonized, and them being, their land and their possessions and their identity is being, has been erased. But it's all great because there's turkey involved. And so, when from the very beginning of this country, it was the idea of white superiority, right? Because white superiority allowed them to create a law that says you're 3/5 of human being. That was in the law. So for you to say that race and bigotry was not embedded in the very fabric of this country is factual heresy, right? Because there's documentation to show that this was actually true. But when you have a law like this that says, we have to remove that portion. Now you want a sanitized version of America that gives a false identity, and it's a false prophesizing of what this country is and projects to the world. And it's actually embarrassing because it's almost like the rest of the world does not have access to our history and information, but you want to teach our society that, we see this country in a certain light. And it actually it hurts us in the long run rather than empowers us, because now we go out in the world as more ignorant than we already are. And if you've traveled outside the country in different specs, you see how they already view America's educational system, already. And now you want to downgrade it into you guys don't even want to identify your own history. Case in point, Germany embraces its negative history, right, to the point where they are a society that abhors any form of anti-Semitism and any form of bigotry. It's but they embraced. They didn't ignore it. They didn't say this ugly thing that happened in 1936, never really existed, and it wasn't the basis of race. It wasn't the basis of the bigotry. That would be ridiculous for us to look at that, right? That would, if we looked at that and be like, we know there was a whole war about this.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be ridiculous. So then, if the rest of the country, the rest of the world looks at America, be like, y'all had a whole war, civil war about race. And y'all are going to say that race was not embedded in the foundation of your country. It's lunacy.
Yes, yeah. It is. And Ms. Wright, or Professor Wright, I want to come to you on the issue. You talked earlier about the children are resilient, right? Children can handle these tough conversations. And so we know that if you don't teach these things early, that, it could be too late at a certain point. In 2021, the Southern Poverty Law Center monitored 68 hate groups in the state of Florida, 68 groups that they have identified as hate groups. And so my question is, should we be concerned that if this legislation passes, it will make that number increase versus decrease?
Of course it will. Of course, it will give feet to a real problem where now you will see things in schools, and I'll go right here to Volusia County that we've heard about, we've thought about, but now it will be acted upon.
Yes.
And so you will have people doing things at every level. We'll probably see a major rise in high school, a major rise in middle school, and middle school is already challenging enough, but now you have all of this being fed by the home. So the parents are going to say to their children, empower their children, you don't have to do this, you don't have to do that. And again, my concern is you will see one of two things. You're either going to see a large exodus of teachers from the profession, or many people are going to have to go to charter schools. They're going to have to create their own schools where their children feel safe. But that too can have some pros and cons because, again, you're now going to teach or embed your students with your own ideology versus having a good mixture so we can have some open and honest conversations.
Yes. And it's interesting that you went there on the topic of charter schools. And Mr. Leonard, maybe you can hop in here and help us on this. So, what's interesting is, right, this bill covers public schools, it covers private businesses, but charter schools are left out of the equation. And oftentimes they get a sizable portion of public money to support those institutions. And so how do we justify, holding public schools accountable in one way, but not making charter schools adhere to the same standard?
So I would definitely like to say that concept is not new either, right? This is just another instance in where charter schools are left out and don't have accountability. They're left out in the same way when we talk about evaluations and accountability and testing and assessments. They're left out in that same way, and I think as Attorney Williams was saying, you have people like Americans for Prosperity. You have people like the Heritage Foundation, as he mentioned. You have them who are wanting to weaken the influence and the infrastructure of public schools in order to push people toward charter schools. There are a few legislators who now refer to public schools as government funded, in a derogatory way, because some of these people benefit off of the funding of charter schools. Some of these people have relatives on these charter school boards. Some of these people are receiving money from these charter schools for campaigns. And so, and that's on both ends of the spectrum, right? Yes. And so I think charter schools being left out of this is not something that's unique in this instance. I think charter schools have always been an exception because they want to be seen as the greater option to public schools while at the same time using public funding. And so if we come back to this, there are many examples that I can give, but in this specific instance, you know, and all charter schools aren't bad. I will say that all charter schools aren't the charter schools that I just talked about who have those connections or who are having students pushed to them. But the majority of these charter schools and majority of the legislators bringing these laws forth are pivoting to those specific charter schools and those specific charter school systems as well.
Yes.
And I'll say this because I know you work for an entity. So since I'm not beholden to anyone, most of our commissioners of education were all major proponents for the last 16 years of charter schools.
Yes.
All of them had some type of connection with a charter school system. So I'll tell you, in the words of my grandparents, my grandmother, who was really wise, follow the money, you'll understand the purpose. And so when you know that they can be very profitable, and yes, many of them are public charter schools, meaning that they are under the control of a school board. However, they do not, and this is a way of making sure that they remain truly independent from that of the public school system without the accountability. And that's what we used to argue about. I don't have a problem with charter schools because we in Volusia County have some really good charter schools, honestly.
Yes.
But they don't have the same accountability as public schools, as a traditional public school. And I think if you really want to see how effective a charter school is, let's have the same accountability system. And then we can support that with our tax dollars because we know that they're going to be delivering a very great education to our children.
Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just one second. So, Attorney Williams, you and Professor Wright are both, entrepreneurs at this point, right? And so we've talked at great length about education, right? The impact that it'll have on our educational system. But I wanted to kind of pivot here and talk a little bit about the impact that it'll have on our business community, right? Essentially, this legislation mandates how the business community is able to train their employees. What impact do you think that will ultimately have in the long run?
Well, the idea that this legislation is going to impact the private sector is really it's disturbing because let's say you have a workplace where somebody or insults not only a coworker, but let's say a client, and because they're racially insensitive or culturally insensitive, or even regarding gender, right? And so now it prohibits you from creating a policy or even a particular educational program within the job, or to say, hey, this is why this is wrong. This is how we're going to conduct ourselves. This is why you can't talk to people the same way. You can't talk to people like that, because now it'd be like, oh, now you're infringing upon my consciousness of guilt and whatnot. And it's very, very dangerous. And I want to say this, like Professor Wright said something very interesting about laws coming back to bite them. In 2014, and this story doesn't seem like it connects, but it does. 2014, Wisconsin, Governor Scott Wright proposed this whole thing about anti-unions, right? And he was big on, actually 2012, and he pushed the anti-union, and then it started to take on effect, anti-union work in Wisconsin. And then in 2014, it came to a crescendo, and it was in 2015 where the legislature passed anti-union law in 2015. Well, then in 2016 and then 2017, a lot of things came to the workplace because Wisconsin legislature passed all these union busting laws. Then a lot of things came in place, and then people were like, we have no workers, we have no protections. We have no protections anymore. And they were so upset. They were so, excuse my language, pissed off. And they were so pissed off about what happened that now, workers were like galvanizing, and they were pushing towards a particular incident of like we got to get these people out of here. So that was in 2017, 2018. Then, we started seeing how in the 2018, we started seeing the rumblings of how people were people were kind of getting upset about the Republican legislature and the Supreme Court. They started removing people who were of that conservative ideology. And I predicted within my own circle, I said, Wisconsin's going to go, is going to go blue, because of what happened 6 years prior, in that particular state. And so it came back and bit them in the presidential election of 2020, right? And so I say all that to say, Republicans can win the battle right now, but you got to be very careful, because people will wake up eventually. And, it may not be tomorrow, it may not be 2 years from now, but you may find yourself in 6 years, 10 years, because history has a long trajectory of people having a long memory and being like, you know what? They really screwed us back then because they got us with these ridiculous campaigns. And so, I don't know if that's it answered the question, but I hope it gave a long range, a holistic viewpoint of how I see this actually impacting not only the business, but also society in general.
And I agree with Attorney Williams, but I'm going to take it a step further. As a business owner, it requires you not to have empathy. And so when I say empathy, if something should happen and you're keeping a track of nothing but, if nothing else, but insubordination, many people will find themselves unemployed.
Yes.
And they will never have to use because you didn't get trained, because I don't have to train you now. And since I don't have to train you, I'm going to keep a record of what things that I feel are insubordinating, and I'm going to terminate you.
That's right.
And so again, I think we have to look at it in its totality, because the truth is now people will probably start terminating people, small, large, black, white, I don't care about the race. And they're going to have other ways of terminating you. I always tell people can hire and fire you without ever telling you the real reason. They can come up with whatever they want to. Empathy is what has helped so many people when it became insensitive conversations or an inappropriate slur or a gesture, or when you talk about certain communities and not even race, you talk about age and you talk about gender and you talk about sexual orientation. We want to make sure you are trained. We want to get you culturally sensitive. So we've tried to find ways to have empathy. You've removed that empathy piece, and I'm gonna just terminate you.
Right. And in Florida, obviously, right to work, it's so there. You don't have protections as a worker already. They don't have to give you cause. They could just fire you. And that may come back again, the history trajectory, that may come back to bite them, because people will be like, I got fired for no reason. I get called literally every week. I got fired for this. I'm like, well, you don't really, I can't do nothing about that. Unfortunately, they can fire you. That you're going to see more and more of that happen, because companies don't have to keep you on if you don't fit workplace culture.
Absolutely. And so those are two really great points. But the follow-up to that is, given the potential impact that it can have on the business community, why do you think they are not speaking out against this legislation in the state of Florida?
Today, because many people are desperate for employees, honestly. And so they don't have the issue of I have too many employees. The problem is I don't have enough. I don't have enough qualified. I don't even have enough who really want to come to work.
Yes.
So with that being the case, they're not pushing back, because I just need a body right now and I'll make it work.
Yes.
That's my opinion.
No, absolutely. That makes sense.
Also, I mean, this is just me. I guess I'm more of a pessimist, but especially larger corporations, they believe in these things. The people who run these particular industries, they're not going to fight against something that they probably funded a legislator that actually believed in this particular policy, right? You bring up Publix, right? Publix Eris is a big proponent of conservative ideologies, right? And has funded not only elections but also campaigns that are similar, if not these particular exact campaigns. And so, as somebody, Professor Wright said, follow the money. And so, private industry is not going to jump up and say anything until it infects their bottom line. That's really, it's capitalism functions, right? And so I hate to bring this up, but you see what happened with Joe Rogan. Spotify's not going to get rid of Joe Rogan because it doesn't infect their bottom line. Now, I know people love Joni Mitchell and Neil Simon, but let's just be honest. Comparatively, the listeners, the people who stream, I guarantee the numbers. The Spotify has looked at the algorithm, looked at the numbers, and like, this is a bigger pie than the people who listen to Joni Mitchell and listen to Neil Diamond, right? Yeah. And so this doesn't affect our bottom line. So we're not going to actually address it. We're going to try to sanitize it because that's what really matters in business. Private industry functions, capitalism functions on the dollar, not on integrity.
Yes, excellent point. Excellent point. So I want to shift gears now. Mr. Leonard and Professor Wright, I know you all have great ties to HBCUs. Attorney Williams, I'm not sure if you do as well.
FAMU.
Okay, there we go. FAMU all day. There we go. Oh, that's great because we have two Wildcats here on the line, so it can balance it out a little bit. But so all of us have ties to HBCUs, right? Given what we are seeing, what we are witnessing happen in K through 12 education, does that further make the case for the relevancy of HBCUs in 2022?
Prior to that, HBCUs have always been relevant. And so what you see now, and I'm a football fan, and just looking at some of the recent recruits, how many of them have opted to go to HBCUs?
Yes.
And so when you go back, and I love history. That's why it's just saddening. At one time, almost 98% of all professional athletes of color came from 4 schools: Grambling, Tennessee State, Southern University. No, FAMU was not one of the top 4. Actually, no school in Florida was one of the top 4, actually. But all of them came from HBCUs. Our traditionally, or our PWIs are great schools. And right. Our students deserve to go wherever he or she chooses. But my thing is, as you just follow the money, and as they begin to get notoriety, more TV time, and better accommodations, many of our athletes and many of our bright students decide to go to schools who could provide and offer them things that HBCUs traditionally could not. What you see is now that we want to compete on every aspect, be it academics, be it athletics, be it socialism. And when I say socialism, Bethune-Cookman, enter to learn, depart to serve. Servitude is a big part of who we are, service. So all of them want to look at the service. They want to look at academics. They want to look at athletics. So they are understanding if they really want to compete, they too now have to change the conversation and change the paradigm, and so that we can become important, but competitive. But as far as being more important, we've always been important, always. And I'm not chastising you. I just don't like to hear people say that, because we're relevant when they were created.
Absolutely.
And we will always be relevant because there will always be children or young adults that need that relationship that only an HBCU or a minority serving institution can provide. Hispanic institution, Native American institutions. So we are unique. We're unique for a purpose. And so we will always be relevant.
No, absolutely.
I'm sorry.
Let me just say one thing. So I could not agree with you more. And I think to rephrase sort of what I was saying, I guess what I'm really getting at is, do you think this wave of anti-Black history will lead to more people attending HBCUs so that they can get the truth and that they can get the facts, and not attending or choosing to attend PWIs as we're seeing in the sports arena.
One thing
So,
I'm gonna give you, Attorney Williams. I just want to say one thing that HBCUs were able to witness during and after the pandemic. Many of us saw a major rise in students returning to HBCUs for a plethora of reasons.
Right.
But yes, I do see more students returning, or more students of color, Black students, going to HBCUs. Yes, I do.
Okay.
And actually, and I was going to say this. First of all, give a shout out to FAMU. Professor Wright said they believe in charity, and we are the College of Love and Charity. So we just have to, so we have to, give a shout out to the Rattler Nation. But we saw something in 2017. There was a study that said that HBCUs, as a collective, saw their general enrollment rise by 23%. Now, really what happened is that in the 2016 election became such a divisive election that it really impacted that, younger people, that they decided that I wanted to be in an environment that encouraged or that was culturally comforting, and it allowed them to, especially for Black students. And so you saw them pivoting to HBCUs because of the response of what they witnessed in that particular run up to that to 2016. And so 2017, the uptick in enrollment of HBCUs was prevalent. I do believe that as these laws become more prevalent throughout the country, and they become more noticeable, you will see again people running to the cultural comfortability of HBCUs in order to not only learn their history, but be, to feel like, a breath of fresh air. Like, I can talk about race and not be subjected to villainy within my own school, classroom, or community.
Absolutely. Mr. Leonard, you want to add to that?
Yeah. So I agree wholeheartedly with Professor Wright and Attorney Williams. Like I stated earlier, I'm a Wildcat myself. So I agree with what they said, but I will add, just as a caveat, I think this bill and bills like these, there are a lot of state-funded HBCUs, and depending on the state. And I think that HBCUs in those states where they have state-funded HBCUs, like, they may be required to walk this line as well. Because students at HBCUs, every student isn't a student of color, and some students are there because they receive scholarships. They come from predominantly white institutions as transfers sometimes, and we still have to remember that some HBCUs may have to walk this line as well. Now, the difference is going to be, unlike in public education, is that, there are organizations on campus who can kind of pick up that slack and still have those conversations and still enlighten those students in that way. But we could also come to a point where HBCUs, are targets for this, because see, in HB 7, it only names K through 12, but there's another iteration of that bill that is K through 20. Yes. Any school that's receiving state funds. That's and right. So luckily that bill isn't moving because HB 7 is moving. But in the original iteration of these types of bills here in Florida, it was K through 20. And so I think that we have to always keep an eye out. It takes us right back to what Attorney Williams said. Just because HBCUs aren't in this legislation doesn't mean that there's a future legislation planned in order to continue to regress who is able to have these conversations and teach these things. And so I think I hope we see a rise, but I think we also have to be vigilant in watching the way they use this bill to build upon another type of foundation.
Yes, and thank you for that. And we've been on now for over an hour, and so we're getting ready to bring the conversation to a close. But before we get there, a few more questions that I have now, more so talking about what we can do to defeat this type of legislation, right? Obviously, we recognize the political climate in the Florida legislature. We recognize that there are more Republicans than Democrats, and so just off of sheer numbers that they can do it. Equal Ground has been working with legislators to try and offer amendments to the bill. One of the amendments that we have sought to put forward is some type of carve out that would allow businesses or schools to offer a optional training, right? So if you're saying that you can't mandate that folks go to this training, what does it look like to offer an optional training and incentivize those who decide to participate? And so, we're trying to get creative and explore ways that we can defeat this or make it better if it passes. Because as Mr. Leonard mentioned, right, it's not always necessarily about whether it passes or not passes. It sometimes is getting the final product, something that you can tolerate and that you can digest. Not saying that we're going to be able to tolerate or digest any of this, because we don't want this to pass in any form. But what do you think we can do to defeat this type of legislation and this type of movement? Ms. Wright, I want to start with you.
That's a great question. So I'm glad that you are bringing forth some ideas of how to minimize some of the damage that we could potentially see, because that's always a starting point.
Yes.
Quite naturally, reach out and have those conversations. So those of us who've been in politics, or for me dealing with K-12, I am going to reach out to all of my colleagues that serve in the House and in the Senate to really have this conversation of what's the purpose, why are we going this route? And like I said, some of them are attorneys, and I'm kind of disappointed that an attorney would uphold this for the simple reason you yourself know the truth. And so we have to hold our elected officials accountable. We should be reaching out to them. Most of us are in other organizations. So why don't we galvanize our organizations and say, let's do this? Quite naturally, many of them have made up their minds, but you can always talk to one. And if you could get one person to the table to have some question, we could easily see what happened in Washington, D.C. when they were trying to get rid of Affordable Care Act. And John McCain was the lone star. And at the very end, everybody didn't know which way he was going to go, but he did what was right. He understood everyone needed health care. We can do the same thing. We need to reach out to our contacts and our legislators and our representatives, and not always wear it on our sleeves. Often we have great intentions, but we wear how we feel on our sleeves, and that causes the conversations to go south. Yes. So have the conversation, make sure you're poised and you're ready to have the conversation and ready for their response, but go in and be able to articulate why you feel that they need to either, one, vote no, and that should be where we stand, or two, well, let's sit down and talk about how this would impact and what other measures that we can do to maybe make it amenable to both of us.
Excellent points. Thank you. Williams or Mr. Leonard?
Yeah, I just want to say, number one, I'd be remiss if I didn't promote my own podcast. I promoted somebody else's. So Uncultured Bias, because you said we talk about having these conversations. We have these conversations weekly. So you can find us on Uncultured Bias on Apple and Spotify. And we talk about race, society, and just culture, Black culture in general. But what I would also offer, and I'm glad you guys are doing a carve out provision, but when you have laws like this, again, you guys are professionals. You guys do what you do. But also figure out a way to hone in the language, because these things are so ambiguous. So maybe we can get some particular idea of this is what is outlawed. This is what, because once you have ambiguous things and you don't have things that are
concrete,
done in a very particular manner, then you have chaos in the legal system. You have chaos in the school system. You have chaos in the structural understanding of history. So maybe the challenge I would say that you good people who are on equal ground and other organizations of your ilk to create a language that forces those legislators to say, okay, what exactly is outlawed? Because what we don't want is to say that is Black history going to be outlawed, because Black history can fall under so much of an umbrella. What under Black history is teachable, and force them to the paint, force them to the carpet, and be like, what do you object to as far as teaching? You're saying slavery, so what can we teach about slavery?
Yes.
What can we teach about discrimination, the civil rights movement of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s? What is outlawed? Force them to figure out, okay, well, yeah, this is not okay to teach. How do we incorporate education and history into these particular bills so that we can help everybody? And then once you know what is being taught, then you can decide on the outside, like, hey, private organizations be like, hey, we're going to teach this because this is not what's being taught. This is not what's allowed to be taught. We can actually have a parameter. Once you identify the parameter of something, it's easier to work around it or work within it.
Absolutely. Mr. Leonard?
Yeah, so I have two answers to this question. My first answer, just as the position I'm in within FEA, is that, on one end, we need to prepare for what the world looks like with this in action, because this bill has moved, and it's moved fast, with very little changes and very little conversation willing to be had by those in majority to change anything about it. But I will also say, with what Professor Wright says is absolutely correct. Adding on top of that, become so familiar with this bill and with these types of bills that when you have those conversations, you are speaking their language, because there has been a lot of doublespeak, a lot of dog whistles, and all of those things. Just the name of the bill being called individual freedom.
Yes.
Right? That plays towards a certain mindset, certain group of people. And so make sure that while we are talking to these legislators, you're talking their language, understanding the bills. And to go to what Attorney Williams said, one of the things that they've been hiding behind is the idea of required instruction, right? Required instruction is something that is put in process by the state that all schools, all counties must teach these things. And in those things, racism, oppression, civil rights, Holocaust, African-American history, all of that is in there. So that's one of the things that they're hiding behind. Like, we're not changing required instruction. What we're doing is, we're just saying that people can't be indoctrinated. And so if this does pass, then we have to know this so well to where we can maneuver in a way. And then my other answer is, we need to start supporting the organizations who are doing this work outside of the school and outside of the businesses. We need to start, if we have to go back to the idea of Saturday schools like the 60s and the 70s, where the students come and learn what they aren't being taught, because this is not the first time where this history isn't being taught, right? Or is trying not to be taught. So we kind of have to look back in a way and say, well, how did we maintain? Because I'm of a certain age. I wasn't even born then, but I know this history, and all of it is not what I learned in school. And so it goes back to that at home piece. So in preparing as this bill goes through, become familiar with the conversation in a way where we can participate meaningfully in the conversation. And on the other hand, prepare to start supporting organizations and individuals who are already doing this work in our communities. So this history is never forgotten, no matter what's on the books or not on the books.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you all so much for those insightful responses. Tonight has been incredible. I think we really had an opportunity to dig in, have a great conversation about the impact of House Bill 7 and Senate Bill 148. As has been lifted up and mentioned, equal ground. We're trying to do our part to be on the front lines, fighting to fight the good fight and ensure that the state of Florida does not censor conversations around race, privilege, and oppression. And so if you have not had an opportunity to do so, I invite you again to text the word censorship to 52886, where you will receive a link and have an opportunity to email your legislators and tweet them on social media and ask that they vote no. The bill has made its way through all 3 committee stops in the House. It has one more committee stop over in the Senate. And then once that happens, it will be going to the floor. And then shortly thereafter, it will make its way to the governor's desk for final approval. And so before we close, I just wanted to give you all an opportunity to maybe do a 30-second closing or any parting words that you'd like to share with our guests this evening. Ms. Wright, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I would just say to our guests, as the advertisement stated, stay woke, know what's happening, get engaged, be very proactive. And at the end of the day, we have to make sure that our children in the United States of America are educated. They are our future, and everything that we do this moving forward will impact them for years to come. Much it would impact them greater than it will impact us. So just be mindful of what we do, how we do it, the legislation that will be created for years to come. You have to stay awake and make sure that we pass the next generation. And I'm sure I'm the oldest person on this call, but it's my responsibility to pass to you something that you can really work with, grow, and make sure that our children and our children's children have a fair playing ground from birth till they leave here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Attorney Williams?
Yes. My law partner would probably be upset if I didn't first promote a law firm, Smith Williams Trial Group. We practice in estate planning and probate. So if you are in the market for looking for a probate or estate planning, wills, trust, all that, please contact us at SWTG Law or 888 SWTG Law. All right. Also, shout out again to the Own Culture Bias podcast. We release every Tuesday. We just had a podcast talking about race and race in society and surrounding the NFL. One thing I would say to everybody is vigilance defeats villainy. And so, you have to, continue to push the narrative, not be afraid to speak to not only ignorance, but also willing to educate, and don't get discouraged by the cloud of bigotry that is encircling our nation, our country, our community, our state, our legislator. You have to be the bright light that pierces through that particular overcast, and and be the education. If you be the thing that you want to see, as someone stated on this panel, know the policies, and then know the policies, and know the history, and then you be able to communicate that and educate, and then effectively defend your position and defend why things like this should not continue. So continue with the vigilance. That is, my charge to you as a community. And thank you so much for allowing me to be on this panel.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Leonard?
Yes. So thank you so much for having me. But I would like to say, just from an education standpoint, right now we are in the largest teacher shortage that we've seen in decades. And bills like this are going to, like it's been stated, are going to make that shortage even larger, because it's pulling teachers out of classrooms, either doing investigation or simply for not wanting to be a target of such an ambiguous bill. I urge you to, from that standpoint, support your local teachers and support your teachers as much as possible, because parents have power on both sides of this conversation. And parents have power on any side of this conversation when it comes to teaching their children. I would also say, just as this bill moves forward and as more bills come up, this bill passing is not the end of the conversation. Elections are directly after session closes on March 11th. So take that and get ready to let them feel what they've done, and let them feel, the brunt of their decisions. And I know Equal Ground is going to do a great job at that in mobilizing the communities that are affected by this. And so I'm just happy to be a part of it. And thank you so much. Thank you so much to Professor Wright and Attorney Williams as well, just for having me participate in this conversation with you all. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all. We really appreciate it. All right. Well, that is our time. I want to thank everyone who has connected with us tonight via Facebook or on YouTube. We had quite a bit of folks who hopped on to participate in this panel. On behalf of our founder, Ms. Jasmine Burney Clark, again, we want to thank you. We invite you to connect with us on social media. You can find us at Equal Ground. You can find our website at equalground.com. And then also, if you text that number, text censorship to 52886, not only will you receive the information to be able to email your legislators, but you will be connected with us, and we'll be able to send you updates when we send those out. So again, thank you all. Again, the Senate's version of the bill, the Senate's version of the bill has one more committee stop before it goes to the governor's desk, and after passing the legislature. And so we invite you to connect with us as we work to defeat this bill. Thank you all, and have a great evening.